Hey everybody, and welcome to this episode of History Tea.
Hi, my name is Wendy Weather. I am the history drag queen, and
I am Ace O'Hearts, and today we are talking about the history of drag. So, without further ado, let's get started because it is a very big issue that is going on in our country right now. There are so many bills that are out against the LGBTQ plus community, including affecting our trans individuals and our drag community, who are people expressing themselves through art. So we figured, hey, what better way than to create an episode?
Exactly. And just another reiteration, these bills that are being passed, they actually harm the trans community more than the drag community.
100%.
Because it's people who literally are just living their life. Literally is who they're
being
mostly
their authentic
targeting.
Selves.
Yes, is who they're most targeting. So
there is no
remember that when you hear about these
expression
bills.
through being trans. That is who they are.
Yes.
And when that's what we're trying to teach is that drag is an expression. And next month we'll be doing a full episode on where where trans, I guess, came about, even though it's been in our history since the beginning of time.
Eons.
Yes. But today, again, we are focusing on the history of drag to maybe better educate some people, and maybe you'll learn something that you didn't know before.
Exactly.
So without further ado, let's start at the beginning of time with the history drag queen.
So I kind of want to start off with one of my friends actually was on a TED Talk not too long ago. If you guys know on TikTok, her name is Madeline English. She's one of my close history mutuals. She's known for her history foundation called The Queer Agenda. And so she has a quote in her TED Talk that I just would like to say because it's a really nice quote. It's a very beautiful sentiment just about queer culture in general. It's a beautiful thing to know that you've been loved for generations. Especially when it comes to drag queer people, we have a plethora of history going back to literally the beginning of recorded human history.
Yep.
So it's really nice to know that even the dawn of time, we were there, we were loved.
Right.
Which I think was just a beautiful
And it was
sentiment
an art form that has been used for people to express themselves since the beginning of time.
Yes. So my first thing I want to talk about is, so everything kind of can be traced to the Greeks, right? Literally almost
100%.
anything. Us talking about the Greeks again, shocking.
What? We're Greeking out, guys.
So, there actually used to be a festival called Saturnalia in Greek tradition. So Saturnalia was kind of their celebration of the winter solstice. And part of that was kind of like this fun opposite day.
Yeah.
Where rich people would dress as poor people as rich people, men would dress as women would dress as men. So it was a whole thing. Everybody have fun, be merry, get drunk, all the things. Well, surprisingly, when Christianity took over, obviously, they took a lot of the pagan traditions and festivals, and the tradition of Saturnalia is actually still prevalent in our culture today. Do you know what that is, Ace?
Maybe? Is it like, no?
So of Saturnalia, the premise and concept of it, the winter solstice, is Christmas.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Now that you brought it up.
Christmas is drag. Christmas is drag.
Because we're dressing everything up to look fabulous.
100%. And so that kind of became an aspect because in ancient theater, women were not really allowed to play men, like in the theater in men's roles, even in Greek theater. So they actually got either men or sometimes like young boys to play female roles in the theater. Right. And which kind of led to this aspect of drag.
Right.
And also I want to add, yes, men were dressing as women, but if you actually hop, skip, and a jump to China, it was the opposite scenario.
Yep, women were doing the men.
Women performers were doing male roles. So drag kings. There were drag kings and queens happening way before you think.
Wasn't it called like breach?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Breach means woman dressed as man is kind of like the vibe, like with the drag being a male presenting or somebody presenting as overly exaggerated female or male basically an over exaggerated male form or female form based on your artistic expression.
Yes. And so that also leads to kind of, let's flash forward in time just a bit, Shakespearean theater.
Oh, 100%. If you have studied theater, even though you may have studied the Greek style, you definitely have studied the fact that men dressed as women in Shakespeare.
And it's a very very common misconception that drag means dressed as girl. That's not what it means at all whatsoever. So the actual actors, whenever they would put on their dresses and stuff, they would obviously drag along the floor. And they go, oh, I have to put on my drags. So literally the word and like term of drag came from Shakespearean culture, but the concept of drag did not.
Referred more to the garment than the artistic act of transformation. Yes.
And then, so my next kind of, let's flash forward just a little bit. So right after kind of like Shakespearean theater was happening, we are going to go to the British Peninsula. Okay. So British pantomime. So pantomime is actually kind of, it's drag, but not drag. It is the like embodiment of drag.
It's very abstract, yeah.
So it's basically OG camp is what it is. So in Europe, it was kind of
camp.
Yes, in Europe it was kind of like the first like era of like female impersonation with drag. They used it as a comedy as part of performance, which kind of contrasts with the seriousness of the plays that they were doing, be it like Greek tragedies or like Italian operas or whatnot. They would dress up in these very high camp outfits and stuff and like makeup looks.
Over the top. Similar to the drag today, right?
So that's kind of what panto is and still is to this day. I know panto is super, super prominent in drag British culture, like British drag culture. And so that is a very prominent thing for them. Whereas in America, pantomime is not really a thing over here.
I mean, it's a very, I mean, even though the idea of pantomime or miming, I mean, it's even a busking thing on the streets and stuff. Hardcore. I mean, the idea of miming and expression, definitely it gravitated towards here, but once you go visit other countries, you realize like, oh, this is where it was prominent.
Right. And I guess there's an argument to be said of like those artists who are doing that are kind of doing a form of drag.
Right.
Kind of.
Of course, I mean, like RuPaul said, you wake up in the morning and the rest is drag. So, I mean, 100%.
Right. So, let's also, another little time warp. Let's, you know, we're going to go to colonial America. Okay. So, after kind of like the freedom of slaves and stuff like that, there was an individual who kind of popped up in queer culture called William Dorsey Swann. Don't know if you know who that is, the absolute mother of all culture.
Yes, look them up.
William Dorsey Swann is the mother of probably LGBT culture and drag. Just in general. I know people are like, RuPaul is the mother of drag. It's William Dorsey Swann. RuPaul is the current queen of
commercial drag.
Queen of commercial drag. But William Dorsey Swann will always be the mother of drag, no matter who you ask.
Right.
So William Dorsey Swann was actually a slave, had been freed, actually enslaved in Hancock, Maryland, who in the 1880s actually hosted some of the first like drag balls.
Right.
Which was basically a lot of queer people kind of coming together, basically just living their life, honestly. Also, I would like to note that William Dorsey Swann is documented the very first person to kind of, in court documents, be the first person to advocate for equal rights of LGBTQ peoples. Way back in like 1896. So,
you heard it here, folks.
William Dorsey Swann, on paper, is the very first person to ever be documented of doing that. We also don't have an actual photo of William Dorsey Swann. A lot of people think when you Google it, that first picture that pops up, which is an African-American man in a kind of like a drag-esque persona, that actually is William Dorsey Swann's friend, who was kind of like one of the main people that were at the balls.
Right.
But William Dorsey Swann actually has never been captured on camera, unfortunately. William Dorsey Swann, the origin of ball culture in Washington. First person to ever be documented on court records standing up for the LGBTQ peoples. But also during the time, there was something kind of happening. Vaudeville was happening. Vaudeville. Now, what I'm about to say is going to be a little crazy. Because we need to acknowledge this.
Drag kings?
So right before that happened.
Okay.
Vaudeville culture, people did dress up as women, but it is rooted in a very problematic thing that I do want to kind of shine light on. most drag that was being seen on stages and plays in America during that time, during vaudeville, was during minstrel shows. So
that's right.
We need to acknowledge the fact that there is a little bit of super kind of racism thing happening.
Side, yeah.
But at the same time, there were minstrel shows. There were two different types of like drag performers happening. There were wretch performers and there were prima donna performers. Prima donna performers were people that kind of like were like the Julian Eltriches, who were like, you know, the very femme high, you know, and there were wretch performers who were actually doing minstrel, like horrible, terrible things, which just to acknowledge that real fast before, you know, we continue on, because I'm not the one.
There's a dark part in history.
I'm not the one to shy away from the stuff that, like, we should talk about the bad things too, also the fun, you know, good things.
Because it's part of the history, you know.
It is, and so
it's a valuable part to be knowledgeable about.
Exactly. And so just to kind of preface, just be aware there is kind of like this very weird dark origin of drag in America when it comes to stage plays. So, but other than that, pretty much people that were doing drag were doing it for literally parties, like actual ballroom parties. Mm-hmm. Like during the pansy craze.
Yes.
During bathhouse gin parties.
Gin parties, yes. Yeah, the bathhouse. I mean, that's the biggest thing is even during the pansy crisis. I mean, that's really when things started spurring into action, and law enforcement really started taking charge and really started pushing it kind of in a negative direction, pushing it hardcore underground, which then of course developed into ballroom culture and kind of expanded ballroom culture.
Yeah, and so kind of when things shift in America. Is specifically in like 1945-ish.
Yes.
Because there's a specific text that gets edited to a way that has caused so many issues in the world.
Right.
We're not going to talk about that text, but so a lot of that is rooted in homophobia, bigotry, all that other terrible, you know, horrible things.
Must say though, close around that time, there was a movie called Some Like It Hot that came out.
So Some Like It Hot was in 58-ish, kind of like 58.
It was like a decade later, but it was kind of. It was more of a screen version of where drag kind of developed.
And also before then, there were also drag shows in World War II. Actually, Ronald Reagan did some of them.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan was in drag, so.
But then, of course, all of a sudden flipped the coin.
Yeah, and then did horrible, awful things. So, also want to preface, there's also other drag artists happening during this time. Drag kings, like you said earlier. One of the very first drag kings in America is actually Charles Hindle.
Yep.
It's listed as Annie Charles Hindle, but from the research that I've kind of gathered, I've researched Charles Hindle a couple different times for different things. It seems to me that they kind of were a trans individual who performed drag. That's just from what I've gathered.
Right.
So I don't know about you.
See, for me, I kind of touched on that too, and I think that there was a comfort level in presenting himself as a drag king and kind of feeling the world out and exploring the world through that way, and bringing in and sharing himself with the world artistically.
Yes.
Because the idea of doing it artistically sometimes was easier than dealing with the scrutiny that the world had.
And they were kind of like a singing drag artist, kind of is what they were. Think very Queen of the Universe, you know, very
well, and very fit in a lot in the cabaret show style circuit. Because that was a way. It was almost kind of a variety show aspect, and the idea of doing that, which still exists today in cabaret, but it definitely began a lot during that period. And as we were talking about, even bringing the drag kings into the world. One thing we're touching back on is the fact that the idea of the pansy crisis and what happened with law enforcement with that and being pushed underground. As it went through the Prohibition era, it then developed into the ballroom culture.
Yes,
as we were talking about.
Ballroom kind of underground. So, in the 60s, there is actually this film that comes out called The Queen. If you don't know who Crystal LaBeija is, probably should find that out.
Yes.
Crystal LaBeija is known for being in the film The Queen. The Queen is actually a documentary kind of film about a drag pageant in, I think, 64, 62? 65?
64.
Or 67? 64?
It sounds like, I believe. Here we are going blank right on camera.
And so Crystal LeBeja is the modern mother of ball culture. So she invented the house system, which, if anybody knows what the house system is, it's kind of like your chosen family. So
if you've seen the show Pose, which has come out within the last couple of years, it came out I think during COVID, around that time.
I think the final season happened during COVID.
Yes, and so if you guys get a chance to go back and watch that, it gives a good perspective on how ball culture was. Of course, it Hollywoodifies it, but it gives you a good idea of the family aspect of what ballroom culture truly is.
And Pose is very kind of loosely based on another film that happened in the 80s, Paris is Burning.
Yes.
Right? You gotta learn how to read. Come on, Corey.
Right. And I will say another one that gives kind of a even more modern perspective on ballroom culture is the TV show called Legendary, where they actually come in and actually show unique processes of what voguing is and what the duck walk really is.
Yes, Laomi, La Roche, yes.
And the ideas of the categories of like glam and beauty and expression through movement, which is very important to the ballroom culture. It was a sense of not only having the houses, but a coming together of people who had a unique interest, and it was kind of considered a safe space for people to express themselves.
And the reason why all this kind of happened to the ground is because we were basically out, like anything remotely LGBTQ was completely outlawed. Like you cannot do any of this at all whatsoever. We're putting you in jail, basically.
Which I will say, law enforcement was still crashing those kind of things. It wasn't like it was a fully safe place. They would break doors down, which I mean, obviously, ultimately led to historical events like Stonewall.
Literally, that's where I was going.
6 days of protesting.
6 days of protest, which is where we get pride. About Stonewall specifically. So, like I said, authorities were cracking down, like literally raiding bars and stuff that were underground bars for LGBTQ peoples, especially even drag artists. There's a couple different riots that are kind of like culturally and historically significant for us specifically. Cooper's Donuts that happens in 59, Compton's Cafeteria that happens 66, and then of course Stonewall that happens in 69. So the Stonewall riot, let's just kind of talk about that real quick, everybody was having a great night, totally fine. It was raided, but a lot of people were not having it.
No. They were fighting hardcore.
Specifically, three individuals, specifically Marsha Pay Them No Mind Johnson,
bless her,
Sylvia Rivera, and drag king Stormy DeLarvery.
Yep.
Like, drag people were kind of the forefront of that basic riot, and Pride kind of became a riot. And
it did.
I like to say specifically, drag artists are the high priestess and priests of our community. And I've always said that. I think it's just a really great sentiment because literally we are usually the ones that are at the forefront, at least the face of certain things.
I do wish that during these prides that we have now, though, there was a real big more focus on history and where it came from.
Yes.
Because I feel like for so many people that do go against pride happening and things like that, it definitely affects the meaning of why we do it or what it means to us. And I mean, there's so many people that talk about what pride means to them, which is great because we all transform through pride. But I think that we have to be careful as to making it's a celebration of people, but it's also a focus on that historical aspect of it. A life-changing history.
And I think that is a great spot for us to kind of take a pause and have our little break.
So enjoy our break, and we'll be back to talk about how it's evolved into media and how it continues to exist with us today and how we can also work together to keep it going.
Yes.
Much love, guys. See you in a minute.
Hello!
Hey everybody, we have some new platforms that you can access our podcast on.
Yes, Hister Tea is actually now on Google Podcasts and Amazon Music.
Yes, and of course you can already access on Spotify, and then of course even if you want to watch the physical version of us talking on and YouTube. See our looks on YouTube.
Yes!
So definitely go check them out. We have a new episode every month. So definitely follow along, join us, and let's learn some Hister Tea and serve some Hister Tea together.
Come on, guys.
Much love to you.
everybody, welcome back.
Yes, and in this half, we're going to be talking about how the drag world had kind of evolved itself into the media.
Yeah, so we're kind of going to go from about 80s to now is kind of where we're kind of going to go.
I'd say probably around the 90s when somebody arose that we all know the name of who became famous, who's now kind of known as the mother of drag for modern.
Oh, RuPaul Charles? Is that who that is?
Charles, yes. So RuPaul actually came out and started doing her song in I believe it's 94?
94.
Is whenever she had her supermodel song, which kind of got her famous. But one thing to remember is that there have been some famous, iconic celebrities who played drag individuals even before she came on the scene. There is a famous drag queen that we all know as Divine.
Come on, Divine.
And she actually, a filmmaker named John Waters. In 1972, was a filmmaker, and he made the film called Pink Flamingos.
Pink Flamingos, which is a very prominent piece of cinematic queer culture.
And you want to talk about camp? Drag, very much. I mean, John Waters is the king of camp.
Come on now.
And of course, Divine, those of you that are out there that kind of don't have an idea of Divine is actually the drag queen that is known to have inspired Ursula.
No, it's on record that Divine was the inspiration for the characteristic of Ursula.
And I'd like to throw in there that with the new movie coming out, that Melissa McCarthy did allude to the fact that she used drag as a big, huge inspiration.
Yeah, Melissa McCarthy did drag in the late 90s as a drag queen called Mrs. Y. So she actually did do several gigs and stuff, and she is a sister.
Iconic.
Like, she's a sister.
Yes.
Like, she's
ally, sister.
She's fully part of the fam.
And then, of course, also moving into a very, very famous franchise known as the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which came out in 1975 and has a very big person known as the King of Camp, Tim Curry. And if you guys have not seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show, you're missing out. Tim Curry is also known for his camp style in things like the movie Clue and other things like that.
Clue is my favorite movie in the world.
For sure. But definitely, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, it was so iconic. It actually started out in the underground kind of scene and overseas as well, and then kind of ventured its way. But of course, a lot of the original cast, the main parts of the cast in any way. And actually, what's interesting is, I wonder if you know this. So in Rocky Horror Picture Show, the shoutbacks that we come up with, do you know where they came from?
I actually don't.
So David Bowie and his girlfriend were sitting in the audience, and they started doing screenbacks, especially his girlfriend would do screenbacks at the stage. And a lot of the things we do today came from
David
interaction. David Bowie and his girlfriend, especially his girlfriend at the time. I believe it was his girlfriend at the time, if it wasn't wife. But yeah, she used to started screaming things because they'd seen it so many times.
Right.
Those traditions came from them and still hold true today.
Which is still very steeped in queer culture.
And is camp.
Come on now.
Yeah, so I mean,
did not know that.
And so on top of that, then even moving into the 80s, a lot of the big hair bands, or even people like Boy George and Pete Burns and Phil Aoki. Yeah, a lot of them started using, or even Twisted Sister, they all started using drag.
Twisted Sister was very,
or even minute parts of drag in their presentation of themselves.
You could even say like Kiss, even was, did that exact same thing.
Well, and then on top of that, moving into movies, I mean, the movie Tootsie. If you have not seen Tootsie, Dustin Hoffman is a male actor looking for a job, and there were, of course, it's very cliche, but the female, there are more female opportunities. So he decided to dress in drag, and he got the job. And of course, then they go through and find out that it's him, but that kind of thing. But another one, as I touched on earlier, that is another iconic person is Robin Williams, who was in
Mrs. Doubtfire.
That's right, Mrs. Doubtfire. And of course, again, a lot of these are coming before RuPaul came out as a kind of public figure for representing the LGBTQ plus community as a drag performer.
And it just goes to show that you and the mainstream media has been ingesting drag as a culture, as an art form, way before even right now.
Right.
Way before right now.
And as we've pointed out, in what's happening now, kind of touch on the modern current situation, is even the presentations, we have Mrs. Doubtfire on Broadway that's going on right now. Yeah. And we have, of course, Hedwig and the Angry Inch and
Kinky Boots.
Kinky Boots. A lot of these that everybody enjoys to watch, but all of a sudden, whenever it becomes a issue that they can attack instead of other specific issues in our country that we need to be focusing on, it's kind of a form of misdirection.
Right.
But anyway, continuing with our history, and of course RuPaul, like I said, 1994 came out with Supermodel, yes. And then even moving into, we had Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which came out in 1994.
Yes.
And then of course one of my favorites, which is Tu Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie
Come
Newmar.
on, Julie Newmar.
Which, I mean, we had Wesley Snipes, we had Patrick Swayze. I mean, and the thing that I love about that movie is that it's so focused on the principles and the respect that they have. The
respect of, yes, that's it's probably my favorite like iteration of a drag film, because it doesn't focus on like the party, the kiki kaka, it's the
underground
essence
scene
of drag. Like, it's the essence of drag.
And also showing, I mean, throughout that movie, especially Wesley Snipes' character, shows them how we are humans and it's a form of expression, and how and demanding respect and how they should be treated. Right. And of course also following the young queen who is figuring out what drag truly is.
And John Leguizamo is a very staunch drag ally. I don't know if you guys know that, but after he did that film, he literally has fought so many different battles and stuff for us.
And of course, I mean, it's also very connected because it is a common journey for people that are exploring drag. I mean, before I became the Ace O'Hearts, I was in the drag community as a drag queen for a little while, exploring and learning about the culture, and of course eventually chose to move on to a more flashy male persona. However, I feel like any kind of research in the community and even studying up on it is definitely allows you to be an ally, and especially if you're delving in and helping. And anyway, back from that.
And to kind of piggyback off real fast, my journey in the drag community is a little different because, of course, transness and drag kind of we're part of the same family. 100%. I actually realized that I was not a trans individual by doing drag. And I don't know if anybody has that. I know a lot of people have the kind of the opposite of that, but I have actually I've figured out my whole person as a human after doing drag. Right. That I wasn't a trans individual. I'm kind of like a non-binary, kind of fluid person.
For me, it always was the idea of getting to show the glam, and like I was fascinated with Liberace. I was fascinated with Elvis. I was fascinated with Elton John. And so for me, it was the idea that like, to me, drag queens were that glam and stuff, and so I got to do that. And through doing that, of course, I decided I was like, presenting female and doing it necessarily wasn't as impactful as me being able to dress like Elton John or these other things. And when I found out I could still express myself in the drag community in that way, I think I truly found my roots. And so to this day, I tell people all the time, I'm like, you take all these people that inspired me and cram them together, and that's where Ace of Hearts came from. But the biggest thing too is from these individuals being advocates. There's a difference in being a part of the community and being an advocate. Another person, Robin Williams, was a very huge advocate because he also did another iconic movie.
Yes.
Where his partner in the movie presented drag.
Yes.
Originally known as La Cage aux Folles.
Yes, which is now known as
The Birdcage. That's right, and that actually came out in...
I want to say...
The Birdcage came out in 1996.
Yeah, it was either 96 or 8.
Another person who started as a comedian that created something was known as Eddie Murphy.
Yes.
And came out with The Nutty Professor and also presented female. And then, of course, we have Tyler Perry, who has presented as Medea. And that actually, that character debuted in 2005.
Yeah.
And then, of course, another hugely iconic movie known as White Chicks, which came out in 2004.
The Wayans Brothers.
That's right. And so it's still continuing to grow even more so. I mean, before Robin Williams passed, there were rumors that he was going to do a Mrs. Doubtfire too.
Yeah.
And the thing too is that's the one thing that's interesting is that we have these two ends of the spectrum. We have people that are doing it for an art form, and then we have people that are doing it because they're exploring who they are, their how they identify, and even it can be really affirming and validating, that somebody is either expressing his art form. And we do have people, who have found themselves in that but still continue to do the art form, which is okay space. But I think that one thing that we can do as allies, and I'm trying to work on this myself, and through this program, is educating people as much as we can, so that they can at least come up with educated reasons why they may be not like something or may not, instead of just not liking it because of what they think it is.
Right, exactly. And with that, RuPaul's Drag Race kind of comes in the picture.
In 2006.
Yes. Kind of comes in the picture.
Right.
And basically kind of explodes.
It did.
Our community.
It was a rough first few seasons they were figuring stuff out.
And I think Drag Race is probably always going to be prevalent in at least LGBTQ plus culture because it kind of, we were here, but when Drag Race kind of became kind of a mainstream thing, it literally was an explosion of like, we're here and we're not going nowhere. Like, we're always probably going to be here.
Right. Another side of the system, or I should say not system, the other side of drag that I think that we have kind of yet to touch on is the pageant side of drag.
Yeah, so pageant systems, which is kind of derivative of what Drag Race is. Drag Race is a competition, right? It's a contest. Well, back literally in the 40s, 50s, the Queen in the 60s was about pageant system. So beauty pageants like Miss America, stuff like that, they would do these with drag artists.
And it's more of there is a level of excellence that I think that needs to be pointed out, that these, I mean, like most pageants, these performers, whether it be Mr. Gay America or Miss Gay America or Mr. Gay US of A or Miss Gay US of A, or even the non-binary categories, MX categories that they are now putting out. In fact, I competed in a pageant as the national showman for Arkansas, and got to see that system, and the fact that we've even expanded the systems to showman at large or showgirl at large, and really finding space in the community to allow people to compete and show their excellence, and the idea that you don't get it right the first time. Right. I think that's a huge thing, is like going and learning and understanding and being able to, save up the funds to do that, because drag ain't cheap.
No, it's
it doesn't cost that as good. Or it doesn't, what is it? What's the phrase?
It
costs a lot to look cheap. That's right.
Cheap.
Dolly Parton, which again is another person who said if she wasn't born a woman, she would be a drag queen. And she's such an inspiration whenever it comes to allyship. So definitely, as you guys, what you've learned here, take it, run with it, educate people, and definitely study up, because there's so many different spectrums of drag culture.
Right.
For sure.
Right.
Is there anything else you wanted to share today?
Yeah, actually. Okay. Something that's, we might cry, we might get sentimental. Okay. So I think we did this whole episode, the history of drag.
Yes.
Right? So I think we kind of need to answer this question. Why do we do drag? Why do you do drag? Yeah. And I'll say why I do drag.
So I actually have only been out as my authentic self and as a queer individual for almost 7 years. And I think that it was very liberating in myself. But I got into drag because it was honestly a chance for me to kind of rebel against my very conservative life that I had led. And so I did. I actually contacted a local drag queen that hosts a monthly drag competition, and my friends had kind of encouraged me to do it, and I was like, okay, I'll do it one time, one time.
Just the one thing.
And I won that month, and they were like, okay, next month, and I was like, oh, there's more to this.
It's gonna go
I guess I gotta come back next month. And I started doing that, and I think getting into that, it was a chance for me to perform and feel free and show my queerness and be glamorous, and I really got to express myself. But the biggest thing too is for me, it was like, I will say, I give my heart. I will carry any drag queen's heels. I will help them carry anything. Like, it is an art form that takes a lot of work to get into.
Literally, you helped me with my bags today.
Yeah, and I think that's where also people don't realize is like it takes a lot to get into this. I mean, even those that have designers make things, it's still communicating with the designer, getting your sizes out there, getting the fittings. It's showbiz. Yep. And so I moved from that, and my grandfather had gotten sick, and so I kind of dropped out of the limelight for a while, and then I started doing it more even for fundraising because I really wanted to help my community.
Right.
And then I think it was more along the lines of I had missed it, but I knew that these icons, as I mentioned earlier, like Liberace and Elvis and all these people, it was kind of a chance for me to express all of those things and all these skills that I learned in my life, because I do magic, I do ventriloquism, I do all these things, and it's such an open arm community that I was like, wait, I can dress as a glamorous guy, a male presenting,
like a showman. That's an option. Yeah.
And so I got into that. It was super validating for me, and I was welcomed by a lot of people. And then even getting a chance to kind of glimpse into the pageant system, you know, and having a high respect for the pageant system of the amount of work it goes into this and the amount of money that's spent into it. And for me, it was, you know, it's one of those things that I still have so much to learn. I know I do. Even being in the drag world as much as I have, and even branching out into the cabaret and burlesque world. And I realized that I like singing, and lip syncing is cool because I can't dance. I'm terrible at dancing. And that's kind of why as a drag queen, I was like, you ain't gonna catch me doing a death drop. These knees, no way. I work for Disney.
You're a great singer.
Yeah, thank you so much. And singing is where it's at for me. I think that's my form of therapy. I get to really feel and express myself through that.
Yeah.
And it's a receptive community. I mean, people are clacking those fans. Sure. In the community, like anything, people are judgy, it all get out.
Right.
But I think judgment can almost, depending on how you take it, make you better. And so for me, I think, you know, in doing this and even getting to branch out to this, which whenever I collaborated with you about doing this show,
whenever you brought it to me, I was like, okay,
it was one of those things that it was like we both bonded over history, and I think that getting history out is important, and also having people that are queer that have been through things on a queer platform, you know, presenting out on these things. So that's kind of a touch on mine. I don't want to ramble too much more, but I think that getting to express myself in this way and also be in the community as well as an ally with my community. And I also want to say that I am helping with Drag Story Time at Pride this year, and I think that is a huge chance to advocate because we need to let people see and kids understand that they can express themselves in any way possible, and that they're and I want to also put out there that drag queens aren't the ones that are getting arrested for any of this stuff that they're doing.
No, trans individuals are very much getting arrested, like just
and it's one of those things that they're attacking. Our queer communities. I mean, it did start here in our state, Arkansas, with a lot of those bills. And don't get me wrong, Arkansas still got a fight on their hands. They're still trying to formulate bills.
They're still trying to, but Athena Sinclair really did kind of help.
Thank you, Athena, and everybody, and all the other allies that showed up to the Capitol to advocate. Because we also had Mr. Gay America that showed up as well. Casey Sunshine, love you if you're watching this. And we had Miss Gay Arkansas also show up there. And don't get me wrong, there were some allies and some individuals that couldn't make it, but they definitely put it out there. And those of you that are on big platforms, please continue to put your stories out there. Please continue to advocate, because the fight is not going to stop. Like we mentioned, there are hundreds of bills that are being formulated for this kind of stuff. But don't let me ramble, because we want to get to your story about how you got into drag.
So the reason why I do drag, when I was a kid, I was a very flamboyant child, shockingly, you know. And my parents kind of just let me do whatever. I know that's very, very rare when it comes, like, I'm from Texas, especially in the South. My parents were like, as long as you're doing it inside the house, like, it's like, as long as you know you're not being crazy in public. And it's funny because I would always play dress up. I would always, you know, throw a t-shirt on my head, be Rapunzel, all that other stuff. And so when I got older as a teenager, just kind of just grew out of that, as like any kids do. And then kind of when I discovered like being queer, like being gay and stuff like that, I kind of like shifted of like, oh, well, I kind of like makeup, I kind of like effeminate things, you know, started to dive into that, and also doing my own research of like, what is drag? Actually, fun fact, the very first drag queen I ever saw was actually Willem Belli in a episode of SVU, which is so weird because when I was a kid, I was like obsessed with like mysteries and stuff like that. And of course I watched CSI and everything, and one of the shows I watched was SVU, and Willem was like one of the first people I ever saw in drag, which is crazy.
And did you know that Willem actually got into that episode because she was trying to get famous off of it?
Literally.
And then that didn't work out first, so that's whenever she was like, okay, I'll go on Drag Race, but I'm not going to follow the rules.
Right. And but yeah, and that's kind of where I found what drag was. And then I was like, oh, and I didn't really start doing drag until 2019, so there's kind of a weird gap of like, I was just kind of a like conveyor of like drag culture, just like, oh, just like a viewer or whatnot. And then I kind of had this like realization of like, am I a trans individual? Am I not? I don't know. Let me figure this out. Let me get up in drag and see if I like it, you know, see what's happening. Didn't, you know, I am very much not a trans woman individual. I'm not power to actual trans women, because honestly, it's a lot. But yeah, and then of course I am very much a history nerd. I love history so much, and my drag, specifically me as a drag artist, is very much rooted in kind of like my worst fear, which my worst fear is being forgotten. just being kind of forgotten about just as a person, individual, because at some point, not to throw anybody in an existential crisis, at some point, you know, you go away from the world, everyone you know goes away from the world. Like, who is gonna say you weren't here?
Having a legacy. Yeah.
Right, who's gonna say you weren't here? And when history is such a prevalent thing for me, I get to tell people stories who think maybe they think, like, their spirit thinks that they're forgotten about, gone forever. But my drag very much is a conduit for all the stories of people that people may think are completely forgotten. Which is what I try to pay homage to in my drag, of just vintage, very historical people, and stories that we might not get to know about.
Well, I tell people all the time that for me, it was also the idea that I felt like I was born in the wrong decade. And I had a dear friend that told me, they were like, yes, but maybe you're born in this decade to keep those decades alive. And I think that's
exactly what it is. And I think, especially with my drag specifically, in telling historical stories and people's stories that may have been forgotten or not, kind of helps me relieve my personal fear of being forgotten, of like, if I'm here telling all these people's stories, at least they're not being forgotten about. So,
and you also mentioned that you grew up in Texas, and I think that's important to your name as well. Do you want to explain your name and kind of where the name came from? Because I think that goes really well with, you know.
Yeah, so my name is actually super camp. It's Wendy Weather, as in like it's windy outside, like it's blowing wind. Because Texas, I'm from Texas. I always love Texas. It's not the greatest, you know, place for me as an individual or LGBTQ people at the current moment, but I'll always love Texas no matter what, because Texas is actually a geological phenomenon, which is, I'm a whole nerd. So there's only 4 different types of wind currents that exist, and they all exist at the same time in Texas, which is why Texas weather is absolutely insane. It's legit studied by geologists and meteorologists and everywhere across the world, because it's the prevalence of all 4 types of wind currents at the same exact second. And hey, windy weather.
Yeah, see, mine is, I grew up as one of those kids that I feel like I grew up in a very conservative household. However, I have always been a very hugely open-minded individual and very curious. And so loving all people, and kind of even those that are hurtful to people and that kind of thing, you know, trying to understand why they are, and maybe they don't have enough love and things like that. And so for me, I've always been a lover of people, which is where the heart's part of my name comes from. And then Ace, I actually, even though it's spelled differently, for the longest time I was like, I don't want my drag to be really sexualized, in the idea of like asexual. And so that's kind of where the Ace inspiration came from. And then the ASO Hearts, I was like, I'll play on word. And my family is somewhat Irish, kind of as we mentioned, you know, last time. And so the O apostrophe Hearts is very
also
Irish.
In the Valentine's Day episode, which so definitely go watch those, by the way.
O'Hare, like O'Hare, which, oh my gosh, here we go, O'Hare, I love her. O'Hara. But anyway, side note, but I was just talking about the O apostrophe, and that's what got me off. But anyway, so yes, definitely, guys, we would love to hear your stories. So if you want to type in the comment section on some of these and share your story, even if you were a drag performer or how you came into doing drag, please feel free to share. We would love to do an episode sometime sharing some of these stories if you're willing to.
I would actually love to sit here, do a couple episodes where we just read some of your stories about your life experiences, or even history topics that you want us to talk about.
Also, another thing, next month we'll be talking about kind of trans awareness and where that awareness started, because it started a long time ago. I mean, the idea of trans individuals, even though the term trans didn't come out in history until, what was it, the 40s? I think it was like that.
That term didn't come out.
The term, but the idea of being a trans individual,
transness as a thing, has been
since the beginning of time.
Literally before recorded human history.
But we're not going to tell you too much history on that. We want you to follow us for next episode. But please, thank you so much for joining us on this one in the history of drag. And if you have any other historical facts that you would like to share with us, we're always looking to educate ourselves, because we are not perfect individuals and we do not know everything.
Exactly.
So please feel free to share those with us. And until next time, I'm Ace of Hearts.
I'm Wendy Weather.
And much love to you. See you next time. Mwah.